And we're live. So, good morning, assalamu alaikum, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to the CICW Book Talk series. My name is Ermin Sinanovic. I am Executive Director of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University in Virginia. And we're live. I just need to turn this off just a second. I'm sorry about this. So our CICW Book Talk series started in April, I believe, after the onset of COVID. We used to have that on campus at Shenandoah University, but due to COVID, we couldn't do it. So we decided, just like everybody else, to switch it online. So we've already had a few of these talks before, and today we are very honored to have with us Professor Andrew March from University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very, very much for having me. It's great that we're able to do this at such short notice across distance.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for agreeing to do it. So the format of our talk is such that Andrew and I are going to go through his book. So the talk is about his latest book, The Caliphate of Man, Popular Sovereignty in Modern Islamic Thought. Maybe Andrew can show us the book. This is my first day back in office after COVID, and of course, packing up everything from home, I forgot the book. But I have the questions, so and whatever is in my mind from the book. But so the format is, I'm going to ask Andrew a set of questions. We're going to go through this 35 to 40 minutes. And then for the next about 20 to 25 minutes, we're going to open it up for the discussion. So for those of you who are joining us on YouTube Live, you have a YouTube live chat option, and you can submit your question through that, or comment or suggestions. And it would be nice if you could identify just your name and where are you from, so that we have an idea, about the geographic spread of our audience. So with that being said, I think we're going to begin now. So Andrew, I'm going to ask you, first of all, congratulations on the book. It's a wonderful, great book, very much needed in modern Islamic thought, especially Islamic political thought. So I'll ask you the question that I ask of every guest, which is, why did you write this book? Why should we care, so to say? What's the main argument of the book?
Okay, so I can first tell you a little bit sort of the way that I sort of accidentally backed into it. As you may know, my first book was on a discourse of Islamic legal studies called the Islamic Jurisprudence of Muslim Minorities, or fiqh al-aqliyat. And I was interested in the way in which Islamic thought related to the experience of Muslims living in non-Muslim liberal democracies, and certain kinds of comparative ethical questions about citizenship, loyalty, religious freedom, individual autonomy, what kind of life world is possible from a religious perspective in non-Muslim majority countries. And, excuse me, and the book sort of left off with questions of citizenship, loyalty, belonging, and bracketed a lot of the more difficult questions about whether, from an Islamic legal perspective, it's possible to see certain kinds of non-Muslim legal and political systems as substantively just. So that was the area that I was working on, and I was spending, I spent a few years looking at the discourse of the objectives of Islamic law, or maqasid al-sharīʿa, particularly in relation to the question of what does it mean to preserve religion as one of the 5 maqasid of the Islamic Sharia. And so this is the area that I was working on, and it was around this time that you had the Arab revolts, 2010 to 2011, and I was planning on attending a conference in Tunisia, so I picked up the book of Rashid al-Ghanouchi, Al-Hurriyat al-Amma fi ad-Dawla al-Islamiyya, and I was interested at that time actually in his views on Islamic legal reform, ijtihad, how to think about what does it mean to apply the Sharia in a modern state. And that's what I was kind of mining the book for. And as I started reading the book, I realized that that wasn't the central concept. The central concept that permeated this entire book was this concept of the umma, or mankind at large, as God's caliph, right? Or the doctrine of istikhlaf. And this is the thread that permeated the entire book. Any discussion about law, sovereignty, authority, ijtihad, the application of Islam in the modern period was actually resting on this edifice, this kind of this tectonic shift in seeing the people at large as God's deputy or vicegerent or caliph, and how that related then to questions of sovereignty. So that idea immediately grasped me. And of course, I had been aware of this, vaguely speaking, as a theme in modern Islamic thought, but it struck me, particularly at a time when countries like Egypt and Tunisia were trying to transition to a form of popularly legitimated constitutional rule, that this was a much more interesting story that I should be looking at. And then as I read some of the secondary literature, I realized that obviously it's well known, right, that this theme of this turn to the people as God's deputy or caliph is well known, but there hadn't been a real study of this. There hadn't been a full study of what this meant and how it related in a deeper sense to a comparative study of theories of sovereignty and a variety of different kinds of democracy.
Thank you so much. That, I think, sets it up really nicely for the discussion of this book. One small question, kind of sub-question to this. Some people may maybe object or not to the gendered expression, the Caliphate of Men, because the Arabic expression is Caliphate of Man. By men here, you mean like a general human being, right?
Yeah, so right. So I think rather than saying, honestly, it was somewhat stylistic. I could have said the universal caliphate or the caliphate of humanity. Something about the phrase the Caliphate of Man, the kind of the generic universal sense struck me as a little bit more felicitous, linguistically speaking. But anybody that would have preferred a more gender neutral expression is more than welcome to object to that.
Okay, wonderful. So you set the book up in the beginning by discussing, obviously the main theme of your book is modern Islamic thought. But in order to get to modern, you obviously have to discuss classical. So what are the main differences between classical and modern theories of sovereignty in Islamic thought?
Right. So the original subtitle of the book was The Invention of Popular Sovereignty in Modern Islamic Thought. And my editor at Harvard University Press, I think quite wisely removed that and made it a little bit simpler. And I think one of her reasons was this idea that the invention of X is a kind of overused expression in book publishing these days. And I think she was probably right. But the argument is that, you know how it sometimes works in religious and other apologetics, right? That if you want to make an argument that Islam or something else is compatible with human rights or gender equality or democracy or whatever it is, that the argument often takes the form of, well, it was always this way, right? That the authentic interpretation of Islam is not patriarchal or is not authoritarian or something like this. And all you need to do is to scratch away certain kinds of accretions and you get to the more authentic form. That's obviously an anachronistic way of looking at things, and that was not the way that I wanted to approach it. I was interested in the way in which, at a certain point, these arguments emerged and became central. And one of the arguments is not only, I think the way you asked the question was, how did Islam see sovereignty before? And one of the arguments of the book is that the problem of sovereignty as a distinct concept has a particular history in Islamic political thought, right? So, and that is kind of the way the book closes as well, which is saying that the problem of sovereignty, which structures thought in a certain way, is something that has dominated Islamic thought in the 20th century, but is not necessarily something that is intrinsic to Islamic thinking about the political. So that's one point that I want to make, is that, when you look at some of the 19th century constitutional movements or reformist discourses, they're not obsessed with sovereignty the way that thinkers later are in the 20th century. They're not obsessed with this problem of who is sovereign, where does sovereignty lie, how must the system be constructed so it does not impinge on God's sovereignty. So that's one important thing, that sovereignty in modern Islamic thought has a history. So that's one point. The second point is that insofar as it becomes imperative for Islamic thinkers, both in the more conservative side of modern Islamism and in the more, whatever you want to call it, moderate or democratic side, to argue that Islam gives some space for popular sovereignty, that obviously has a history. Nobody really took that seriously or even considered it until the 20th century. So the way that I summarize it very briefly is that up until about the 1920s or 30s, Islamic political and constitutional thinkers imagined governance as a kind of condominium of authority between a ruler, however you called him, an imam, a khalifa, a sultan, wali al-amr, a hakim, some kind of executive authority figure. I will refrain from calling him secular for obvious reasons, and the body of scholars or jurists. And so the question was, what is the scope of authority that scholars have within courts to govern society? And what is the authority that rulers have to make discretionary public policy judgments, laws, edicts in the realm of maslaha or public policy? And the only qualification on this is standing somewhere in between them is this idea that there's a body of people called the people who loose and bind, ahlul hal wal aqd, that is somehow the representative of the ummah in appointing a ruler, consulting with him, and ultimately removing him if necessary.
All right, so the question then could be asked, and I think to some extent you've already explained it, but I think it's always good to contextualize. So just briefly, what prompted these changes? They may be obvious to a lot of people, from classical to modern discussions, but what are some of the main factors that prompted these Muslim thinkers to start thinking about sovereignty in new ways?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that if you are, so one move is that when you have the creation of nation states in Muslim majority countries through either direct colonization, right? You know, the direct occupation and colonization of Muslim lands, in which then colonial powers like the British or French created territorially bounded nation states, or in which these were created as an act of resistance to efforts to colonize, like in Turkey or possibly in Persia/Iran. You have territorially bounded nation states in which the question of representation, or who these states represent or speak for, becomes paramount. A second move is that when the legitimacy of these nation states is called into question, you have certain kinds of voices, particularly Islamists, that are seen as representatives of a kind of populism, right? That these forms of authority, these secular forms of authority, were imposed on them from outside, and that the authentic voice of the people would be in an Islamic register. So it becomes natural that you have this claim to speak in a kind of populist register. But the other, I think, more interesting factor is that up until, let's say, the 1920s, and this is why my book kind of begins there, you can imagine a kind of continuity or restoring continuity. You can imagine that there are a class of scholars, a class of educated elites, and a class of rulers that can try to restore authority. But once this has been ruptured, once this has been destroyed, and you have a different set of authorities governing Muslim countries, the question is, who has the authority to restore a more legitimate order? And this is why I think, in a very interesting sense, and thinkers like Maududi and Qutb and others, you get the sense that if Islamic law is going to be restored, if God's rule is going to be restored, you can't just assume that there are traditional authorities like legitimate rulers or scholars that are simply there as the custodians of this authority. And it becomes, for some reason, much more plausible to argue that that the agency to bring about this kind of revolutionary change rests with the entire body of believers, as opposed to some kind of designated representative.
Okay, thanks a lot. So you mentioned Mawdudi and Qutb. We're going to get to them in a little bit. But before that, I would like you to talk a little bit about Rashid Rida, because he emerges in your book as somebody who basically lays the foundation for many of the conversations that were taking place at the time during his life, but especially after him. And also to kind of situate it within the context. This is the time of the fall of the Ottomans, right? The dissolution of the Caliphate. And it is something that Muslims throughout the world sort of took notice of. And basically we're trying to discuss, so what do we do now, basically? And you do talk in your book a little bit about the conferences that took place in various places and in Muslim countries, discussing with invitations being sent out throughout the world, including, I believe in your book, you mentioned to Argentina and the United States.
Right, I think it was Poland, yes, right?
Yes, of all places. And this is, we're talking about the 1920s, right? We're not talking about today. So actually 100 years ago. And so Rashid Rida emerges as this voice that kind of reconceptualizes many of these notions and sets the theoretical foundation. So tell us a little bit about him and his work.
So actually, if I could, I think Rida in that period in general doesn't function so much as a beginning, but as a kind of a break point, to sort of a liminal moment, to use an overused expression. That so when Rida is writing these series of essays that end up compiled into the book called El Khilafah, or the Caliphate, going into the Caliphate conference that he organizes or helps to organize in Cairo. Part of the point of that chapter in my book is to say, up until the 1920s, it was still not claimed that, first of all, the references in the Quran to God deputizing a caliph on earth refer to the people at large. So shortly afterwards, right, Mawdudi starts writing in the 1930s and 40s. Then it becomes kind of obvious that the agent identified in the Quran as God's Khalifa, or sometimes plural Khala'if on earth, is the Ummah at large. When Rida opens this book with, as an epigraph, that verse 230 from the Quran, he still means it to refer to the office of the caliph. So traditionally, and sometimes still today, when you're looking at more traditional discourses, that verse in particular, as well as others, is used as the proof text to say that the caliphate as a specific political office, not the status of the ummah or the people at large, but a specific office occupied by a single man, is a permanent obligation on the Muslim community, right? That God appointed David and the prophets, and then the specific office of the caliphate is a successor to that. So as of the 1920s, while Rida at one point says in his book that the Islamic Caliphate is a kind of republic, he uses the term Jumhuriyya to argue that it's representative, that it's not tyrannical, it's governed by the rule of law, that non-Muslims have nothing to fear from the restoration of the Caliphate. He is not arguing for popular sovereignty in this book. In fact, he's arguing, I claim, for the constitutive authority, right? Or the constituent power of the people who loose and bind. So that's the whole point of this Caliphate conference, trying to invite everybody from all over the world. It was a non-sectarian invitation. He was trying to invite Shia, Ibadis, Zaydis. I'm not sure what Ahmadis, but nonetheless, he was trying to assemble as representative as possible a body of ulama. And the assumption was, if all the ulama are in the room, they have the authority to elect a new caliph. And no Muslim would have any grounds for objecting to the recreation of the office on those grounds. So that's a second point. The third point is that for Rida, the specific office of the caliphate is extremely important, not only for resisting colonialism, Muslim political unity, creating a political body, but also for the ongoing preservation of the Sharia. So how is the Sharia going to remain effective, alive, vibrant in modernity? So for him, the caliph was a kind of sine qua non of an ongoing vibrancy of the caliph. So in the book, I compare Ridda's idea of the caliph to a kind of Barack Obama figure in certain kinds of mid 2000s liberal imagination, that Obama is this figure who could be on the Supreme Court, but he's also, a potentially inspiring political figure. That's kind of how Ridda imagined the caliph, right? That he represents Islamic public reason in addition to public power.
Not so much philosopher king, but more like a philosopher jurist.
Something like a jurist, and something like both in creating the political space and in his own personal capacity, right? That if some kind of ijtihad or adjustment to the Islamic public law were achieved under the auspices of this public office, then it kind of has this presumptive authority. That's what, so it kind of like creates an Islamic public sphere. That's what the Caliphate meant for Ridda on my reading. And that's really the big difference. When later writers talk about this, yes, they want to recreate an executive office, and this executive office has authority, can speak in the name of ijtihad and so forth, but it's really the people that is generating the legitimacy and creating the public sphere.
Right, thanks. Kind of like a footnote, and if you could maybe just briefly answer this. One book that often gets cited from that time is Ali Abdul Razik, Al-Islam wa Usul al-Hukm, right? Islam and Foundations of Government, or Principles of Power, or whatever you want to, however we want to translate that. And you said something in your book, you have a line where you said, and that book is really not that interesting, or something like that. Can you explain what you mean by that?
It was kind of a political and intellectual earthquake. I think in the book that I say that there are two main events that spark a kind of flurry of writing on the Caliphate in the 1920s, right? There's a number of books, not only by Ridda, but by a number of other figures. And one of them is the abolition, first of the Sultanate and then the Caliphate out of Ankara. And then this book by Ali Abdul Razik. And it's sort of it's a kind of totemic book that symbolizes, the beginning of a kind of modern 20th century Islamic secular modernizing discourse. I don't find it to be a very persuasive book. I don't find it to be a very well-argued book. I think it's kind of confused about what is meant by political authority. I think it was a book that was very, very easy for his contemporaries to refute, but nonetheless, it is symbolic in arguing alone in his time that Islam did not prescribe any particular kind of political office or form of government. I don't know, others may differ. Your mileage may vary. People may find it to be a much more intellectually compelling book than I do.
Sure, absolutely. All right, so let's move on. So we're kind of halfway through the book in a way, but really the gist of the book is a discussion of Mawdudi, Qutb, and Rashid al-Ghanoushi. And you make, again, a very interesting choice in your book. You talk a little bit about Hassan al-Banna, right? The founder of the Muslim Brothers, which is this quintessential Islamic movement. Though as somebody who knows a little bit about Indonesia, I always like to say that the first mass Islamic movements originated in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, what became Indonesia. In 1912, you have Muhammadiyah, and then you have Nahdlatul Ulama in 1926. The Muslim Brothers do not get established until 1928. So that's always an important thing to put it in a global context, but there is no doubt that the Muslim Brothers are probably the most influential Islamic movement of the 20th century. But then after discussing all of that, you say, well, but I'm not going to really talk about al-Banna. I'm going to really focus now on Mawdudi. Why do you do that? Why is Mawdudi in this context more important? And can you tell us a little bit about Mawdudi and his contribution to this topic?
I mean, do you find Banna to be as rich and complex of a political writer and essayist as Maududi and then perhaps later Qutb and others?
No, not in that sense. Obviously not.
Yeah.
He didn't write books on even though he did write pamphlets and short treatises, but not in the way. And obviously his focus was on organizing the movement, not so much on writing intellectual books and things like that. So yeah.
So that's the answer to your question, right? And I do cite Benna, right? So I have one of the things, so the book kind of does go Ridda, Maududi, Qutb, Ghanouchi, but interspersed, I make an effort to survey and summarize a pretty vast amount of literature that happens between Qutb and Ghanouchi. And I say some things about that. We can get to that later if you want. But in my mind, Maududi is a much more important figure intellectually in terms of framing modern Islamic political thought in terms of these two concepts. One, divine sovereignty or hekimiyya, and two, this idea of the universal caliphate. And he's not the first to talk about either of these things, but because he ends up becoming one of the more influential, there's a lot of literature attesting to the fact that it's Maududi, when he gets translated into Arabic, that really has a transformative impact on Qutb and others who are reading, who are in the late 1940s and early 50s, spending a lot more time fleshing out what is meant by a modern Islamic doctrine of politics, political agency, legitimacy, diagnosing the political problems of the age, the critique of jahiliyyah and secularism and so forth. So there's simply a lot more to work with in Maududi, and there's a lot more. And again, Maududi is still, for me, a kind of transitional figure because it's still there to argue that even though he is the one, and the metaphor that I use in the book is that he releases into the intellectual bloodstream of modern political Islam this idea that the caliphate also refers to the people at large. So this then becomes an idea. In fact, you didn't ask about Senhuri, but Senhuri, the Egyptian jurist that codified modern Arabic civil law, he writes his dissertation on the caliphate in France, and I think 1928. And it's a very, very interesting book in which he both refers to the ongoing authority of the scholars, right? He says that the Islamic caliphate is a kind of epistocracy, right? It's a gouvernement des sages, I think is the expression in French, of scholars, of sages, but also says that it rests on the underlying authority of the people without using the expression the caliphate, right, the universal caliphate. Later, when that book gets translated into Arabic in the 1980s by his daughter and son-in-law, then they just simply use this expression, right, that the umma is God's khalifa. So somewhere along that line, this has just become standard boilerplate a way of talking about Islam and the status of the people. And on my view, it's not that Maududi is the first or the only one to talk about this, but it really is unleashed into the bloodstream from that period. Maududi is also the first one, I think, to really take seriously what an Islamic constitution would look like from the 1930s into the 1940s. And you have some very, very complex discussions of who has the authority to reconstitute Islamic law, where do the scholars get their authority from, what is the balance of authority between experts, the scholars, and the people. In my view, still heavily weighed on the side of the scholars, right? So I don't argue that Maududi ultimately argues strongly for a conception of popular sovereignty, right? He refers to his own theory as theodemocracy, famously. And there's a lot that is very, very important about the status of the people. But on my reading, it's still heavily weighted on a kind of governance of experts, at least that is, in his theoretical writings on Islam and constitution.
Sure. Thank you. I was actually going to bring up Razak Senhuri earlier, but somehow in our conversation, we kind of glossed over it. But absolutely, his contributions were absolutely crucial in that period as well. And as you said, it influenced, so many different constitutions, especially in the Arab world. And I would fully agree with you. I mean, the choice that you make, I wanted you to speak about that. And what I'm glad that you're doing in your book and in this presentation too, is that today, oftentimes, by so many people, they look at the Islamist thinkers like Maududi or Qutb, and they try to dismiss them as if they were somehow shallow or not deep enough or not. We may disagree with many of their ideas, but I think what we cannot disagree on is that they seriously engage with all of these important questions, and that they made a certain contribution that that I think is profound, even if it needs to and has to be critiqued and criticized. So that's really kind of just sort of to wrap it up. So I want to kind of shift, and I know there is so much to be said about Maududi, but we need to sort of keep it on time, and the idea is really to introduce people to main ideas in the book and hopefully encourage them to buy it and read it, right? So there's only that much we can do. But I really want to talk a little bit more about Qutb. And one thing that you mentioned about Maududi and Qutb, you call the vision of Islam as propagated by Maududi and Qutb as high utopian Islamism. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by high utopian Islamism? And maybe use that as a segue to discuss Sayyid Qutb a little bit.
Great. So I'm really glad you asked about that, because this is also an expression that I hope is sort of taken on and treated seriously by subsequent scholars. In my reading, pre-modern Islamic thought is not particularly utopian when it comes to politics. Now, if you read classical thinkers like, Mawardi or Ibn Khaldun or others, the Islamic political order or the Caliphate is very often treated as, well, why do we need the Khilafah? Well, other forms of rule can bring us welfare, maslaha, or even sometimes justice in this world, but the Khilafah brings benefits in this world and the next, okay? But it's not really fleshed out the way in which politics is a site for the realization of our good. So this is a classical kind of distinction in political philosophy or the history of political thought, right? That in classic Greek political thought or Greek political philosophy, politics is where we become virtuous. Politics is where we find our good. And politics is also a necessary space for us realizing our humanity. And you see this in some of the Islamic political philosophers, right? Somebody like Farabi, for whom whether or not we attain our maximum reason and virtue to a large extent depends on whether we are governed by a genuine philosopher, okay? So that's one distinction. Now, when you like Ibn Khaldun, for example, the focus on political philosophy is on the reduction of evil in the world, right? Why do you need a caliphate? Well, because if you don't have a ruler, people will fight, they will destroy each other, and you need governance for political order. And to that extent, I would argue that much, not all, but much of pre-modern Islamic thought is kind of Hobbesian in that way, and is not exactly minimalist, but it's not focused on the way in which human beings become perfect and virtuous through politics. Okay, perhaps that was the realm, that was the business of other areas like piety or asceticism or Sufism or something like that. So that's one observation. The other observation is that when thinkers like Maududi, but I think this is really becomes fully developed in somebody like Qutb, when they start to think about what is wrong with secularism, what is wrong with liberalism or Marxism or modern tyranny, it is not just the technicality that these political systems don't govern by what God has revealed, or they're not applying Islamic law. It's not just that it's sinful or that they are applying some kind of law that Muslims are then complicit in applying or abiding or something like that. There is an attempt to think deeply about how politics becomes a site for our own moral perfection. And in Qutb, Maududi alludes to a lot of this. He makes claims about this, but on my reading, Qutb is where this really becomes fully developed. And the argument is a moral, psychological argument about the Islamic Sharia. That the Islamic Sharia is perfectly matched to the human fitra. That it is perfectly balanced between our base human desires and our exalted sort of spiritual desires. That it's not too demanding upon us, that it does not expect things of us that the human being cannot bear, like Christianity does in loving our enemies or forgiving attacks against us or something like this. So there's really this effort to say, one, how at the individual level, the Islamic Sharia is matched to our psyche in such a way that it's how we become morally emancipated. Second, there was an effort to think about how the economic, social, and political aspects of Islam are also perfectly matched to this. And there's also this kind of what I compare to Rousseau, this Rousseauvian attempt to say that we cannot be good, morally speaking, Islamically speaking, unless the political and social conditions are structured in a certain kind of way. When we are dominated, when we live in conditions of radical inequality, when the wealth is not seen as a kind of shared good amongst all Muslims, we become morally distorted. And so there's this effort to say that if the Islamic system were ever implemented, it would kind of magically bring about not only justice, legitimacy, in this technical sense, but also this moral transformation of individuals in society. And that's why I refer to it as utopian, not to say it's unrealistic, it's pie in the sky, or that it's silly. A lot of people hear utopian and think that I mean that. Rather, what I mean to say is that it's this, I think, quite unique effort in Islamic, in the history of Islamic political thought, to make an argument for how the Islamic Sharia at the social, political, and economic level is this blueprint for realizing not only a just society, but also the moral emancipation and perfection of individual Muslims.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think this has clear echoes even in Western political thought. I still remember when I used to teach Islamic politics at the Naval Academy, and we were reading Sayyid Qutb actually and Maududi, and one of my students said, you know, my father, he's a really conservative person, and I think he would really like this. So next week he comes to class and he says, you know, I called my dad and I read to him from Sayyid Qutb, and I removed any reference to Islam, you know, and so on. And he said, when I finished reading, my dad said, that is amazing. That's exactly what should be done, you know, like, who wrote that? And then, you know, his son said, well, it is Sayyid Qutb. He's considered to be like a father of modern Islamic radicalism. And I think that sort of speaks to this notion that it captures certain political imagination that is universal, actually.
So you radicalized him, Ermin.
You know.
There we go.
Yeah. So in any case, so that kind of universal kind of idea, I think, is what brings us then to the next question, the doctrine of the Caliphate of Men, Khilafat al-Insan, which really constitutes kind of the gist of your book and the argument. And you really dedicate a lot of time discussing this, especially in the thought and ideas of Rashid al-Ghanouchi. So can you tell us a little bit more how kind of this genealogy of this idea comes and why al-Ghanouchi is so important when it comes to this?
So, you know, in the book, I argue that in Maududi and Qutb, for whom these ideas of the universal caliphate are paramount, they permeate their writings, right? They're completely ubiquitous. In those writers, particularly Qutb, it's mostly an argument for a certain kind of responsibility. That because mankind is God's caliph, it's the umma, right? The Muslims in particular, that have this obligation to be obedient to God, and that they are the ones. It's kind of like the restoration of Islamic law is kind of like this, you know, big fard kifaya, right? Or collective obligation on Muslims. Nobody else is going to restore God's virtue and God's law on earth. Now, after this, right? So as we're all very familiar, you know, thinkers within the Muslim Brotherhood and the broader Islamic movement spend a lot of time grappling with this legacy of thinkers like Qutb, right? Partially because we all know what happened with certain segments of the Islamist movement in Egypt, taking these themes of Jahiliyyah, becoming takfiri, engaging in violence, declaring entire societies to be kafir, and so thus liable for or eligible for violence or whatever. And this becomes a very, very problematic legacy within Islamic thought. On the one hand, the Islamist movement from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s remains modernist, right? That is the sense that they are, many of them are lay figures. You have scholars, of course, right? Trained ulama like Muhammad Ghazali and Qaradawi and so forth that are contributing to this. But it does not become, let's say, like a neo-traditionalist project, like what we see right now on the part of a lot of anti-democratic authoritarian thinkers, famously Bin Bayya and others, that are trying to say Islamism has unleashed this monster of chaos in the Muslim world. And the way to put that back in the box is to just go back to obeying scholars and rulers. So the Islamist movement can't do that. It remains part of this broader modernist trend of not anti-clericalism, but non-clericalism, right? That you have thinkers like Turabi and Ghanouchi and, Muhammad Amara and others that are, whatever you want to call them, okay? Highly educated, but non-clerical intellectuals. So that's one point. The other is that it remains this kind, it maintains this kind of political perfectionism, okay? Islam is the solution, right? And that there's still supposed to be this moral transformation, and that the point of politics is to bring about a kind of moral perfectionism, right? This fusion of the needs of the body and the needs of the soul, sociability, right? Solidarity in society as well as individual piety, right? There are these, up until the revolution in Tunisia in 2011, Ghanouchi is still writing these things that are very, very perfectionist in terms of how he understands politics. And it's still organized around the idea of the application and the supremacy of the Islamic Sharia. So that's this legacy. But then there's this need, not only this need, but I think this genuine intellectual and moral sentiment that this can't reduce to a collective takfir of societies that are not adopting this. And it can't result in a kind of Manichaean attitude towards others. So that's this legacy. And one of the ways that I think it manifests is in this effort to say Islam is not incompatible with democracy. We are not anti-democratic, but the kind of democracy that we believe in rests on a kind of collective moral authority of the people. And that's why there's this transformation, or this richening, I would say, of what the doctrine of the universal caliphate does from a thinker like Qutb to a thinker like Ghanouchi. So in Ghanouchi, it becomes this much, much richer concept that is doing a lot of work that was not anticipated on my reading by figures like Maududi and Qutb.
Would you say that we would not have al-Ghanouchi if we didn't have Qutb?
Well, yeah, but that's kind of trivially true, right? I mean, it's kind of trivially true that that all of modern political Islam is part of this Islamic modernism, right? That begins to a certain extent with Abdu and Rida, and then grapples with what is an Islamic state, what is an Islamic political order, how exactly does Islamic law become fit for modernity, and so yes, it's trivially true that everything is in some ways indebted to what comes before it.
Thank you. So I would just like to ask one more question to kind of conclude this part of the discussion. Then we move on. We already have a number of very interesting questions and comments by our audience. So what is the implication of these ideas, and how do they reflect themselves in modern politics in majority Muslim countries? I mean, you already mentioned something about, for instance, this neo-traditionalism right now, Bin Bayya and so on. Obviously, these ideas are not just ideas in books. They are ideas that are being discussed, that have been translated into actual politics, that have been tried to influence constitutions and political processes in different countries in the Muslim world. So what this whole discussion mean for the politics as it is today in Muslim countries, and especially in the Arabic-speaking world?
There's always a gap between theory and practice, or political ideology and the actual construction of political worlds, with the possible exception of a country like Iran, where you have an attempt to create a political order almost exactly in the image of what was theorized previously by Khomeini and others. Although even there, it famously has departed from a lot of what Khomeini wrote in the 1960s and 70s. The big idea, I think, is this: whether the emphasis was on divine sovereignty or on popular sovereignty in 20th century Islamist political thought, these theories were dominated by the specter of sovereignty as such. And so what is sovereignty? Sovereignty is a kind of discourse of unitary, uniform authority. If God is sovereign, God is the only one who commands. All law must come from this single authority. Nothing is legitimate unless it has been allowed or authorized or approved by this single authority. And of course, that's the argument, and thinkers, historians of political thought that try to argue that thinkers like Hobbes represent a kind of transference of theological themes to political themes, right? Like nothing is authorized unless it comes from a state sovereign. Similarly, when the argument in thinkers like Ghannouchi and Turabi and others claims that no, there's no incompatibility between divine and popular sovereignty. On the one hand, this is to a certain extent a softening of the discourse of divine sovereignty, but there remain some extremely important constraints. Now, one of the constraints is this: if the people is going to be sovereign or is going to partake in divine sovereignty, what has to be true? Now, while it is true that particularly thinkers like Ghannouchi in his writings from the late 1970s to the Tunisian Revolution argue for a kind of political pluralism, right? There'll be various political parties who will work with a variety of political forces. There is still the claim that if we are going to say that the people is sovereign, the emphasis is on a kind of moral unity. So when Ghannouchi talks about why is our theory not like Montesquieu or Madison, he will say Montesquieu and Madison were concerned with managing pluralism. They were managing human disagreement. And thus you get theories of ambition counteracting ambition, or they develop theories of republicanism that are about separating powers so no individual branch of politics can dominate all of a political community. Ghannouchi explicitly says that's for them, not for us, because they are burdened with moral pluralism. We are not. We can assume a kind of moral unity around Islam. And so when he's talking about institutional design and constituent power and what kind of constitutional orders can be developed, of course he says, of course there's going to be a judiciary, a legislature, and an executive, and they will be somewhat separate. But their separation must always be less important than the way that institutional design is structured around harmonizing their cooperation. Because the ultimate purpose of an Islamic state is to coordinate cooperation in the pursuit of a single moral aim, which is this realization of an Islamic public order. And so the assumption is that a people can be sovereign in Ghannouchi's theme because the people shares a kind of moral purpose, shares an understanding of a moral good, or what in Rawlsian political philosophy would be called a comprehensive doctrine or something like this. And you can deal with disagreement and pluralism within this, but the system derives its authority because a pious, virtuous, and epistemically sincere people has authorized it and is participating in an ongoing way in a kind of Islamic public sphere. Now, when you get to something like the Tunisian constituent period between 2011 and 2014, what are you dealing with? You are not dealing with moral unity, never mind political unity, right? You're dealing with radical moral pluralism. Now, you could say you only have moral pluralism because of colonialism. You only have moral pluralism because of Bourguiba and Ben Ali, that all of these radical secularists, they will go away over the next 30 or 40 years. You could still hold that view. You could still hold that view that radical moral pluralism that extends to even questioning whether Islam and the Sharia is the foundation of political and social life, that's a crisis, that's an aberration, and that should be removed, right? So that's one possibility. Another possibility, as you say, that there are certain kinds of political goods, stability, cooperation, consensus, collaboration around shared worldly ends that trump, sorry to use that expression, the pursuit of higher moral, political, and spiritual unity within a political community. So to sort of wind up this long-winded response to your question, on my reading, there is a kind of crisis in Islamic political thought with what to do about the depth of moral pluralism, right? How do you treat the brute fact that in many Muslim countries, you can't just assume that you have a political community that is already in agreement around ultimate moral purposes and ways of knowing? Do you deal with that as a legitimate fact? Do you deal with that as simply a brute fact that you have to accommodate to avoid worse things like civil war or a return of repression? Or do you somehow deal with it as a permanent change in modernity? And that is something that I think is very, very difficult for Islamic political thinkers to grapple with in a very deep sense.
Yeah, and it's something that obviously Ghannouchi is one of the people that is really trying to kind of give attention to. His famous speech on Islam and secularism and how the two are related or interrelated was, I think it was given a year or two after he returned to Tunisia, as being hailed as one of the kind of landmarks in developing that line of thought. So I would like us to move. We have a number of questions and comments by our audience. So let's now get a little bit more interactive with them. I think we have covered sort of main arguments and the main sort of outline of the book. And obviously, I encourage everybody who is interested in these topics to get the book and read it, because it's such a great exposition of these ideas, well argued, well written, as we become accustomed coming from Andrew March. So, the first question or the comment, so would it be right to say that Muslim scholars better understood the depth of representation in Islam after being inspired by experimentation in secular democratic politics, leading to the possibility that Islam requires that Muslims must coexist with other forms of politics in order to gain insight required for ijtihad?
I don't know about the causal mechanism there. In my mind, so you might say that, well, Ghannouchi is in exile in England for 25 years or something, and that experience of seeing the working of civil society and so forth. That I think there's something to that, right? There's something to the fact that as Ghannouchi himself explains in 1993, that his purpose is to perfect democracy, right? It's not just to, okay, fine, we can accommodate elections and parliamentary rule. It's to say, well, modern European history has produced these, some of these mechanisms which we can admire, right? Rule of law, parliament, separation of powers, but Islam can reinfuse them with spirituality and moral purpose and a moral grounding. But so that's possible. But I think the more important thing is that the difference between political communities in which the political forces themselves are more or less balanced. Okay, so in Tunisia, of course, politically in many ways is a disaster, right? The parties hate each other. They keep on having elections. Nobody can dominate, and they have a very hard time putting a government together. You don't want to see the workings of the Tunisian parliament as some kind of like happy success story, right? The depths of enmity, particularly on the part of some of the radical secularists towards Ghannouchi and his party, are pretty disturbing. But nonetheless, nobody can dominate. And when nobody can dominate, you have no choice but to try to create a political system on the basis of constitutional compromise and negotiation. Whereas you have other systems where, let's look at a country like Egypt, where in the Constituent Assembly, the combined Islamist forces of the Brotherhood and the Salafis were something like 70% of the Constituent Assembly. Now, simply in political terms, they could have dominated, and this leads to the kind of counter-revolutionary violence that you saw with the coup, right? So there's this sense that there's no political or demographic constraint against the potential for future domination, so we better dominate them now in reestablishing authoritarianism. Another example, of course, is Turkey, where the AKP and Erdogan begins as a democratizing force because they are winning elections without a massive overwhelming majority, and they are able to bring about all of these democratizing changes to the military, the judiciary, parliament. But once they become a politically unassailable force, there is nothing to stop Erdogan himself from becoming a kind of authoritarian, right? So the single greatest impact is not ideas. It's not whether people look at the value of representative democracy from some other context and then import it. It's whether within a particular country you have a balance of political forces internal to that country that make political collaboration the only possible way of doing politics.
All right. So in some ways, political realism in the end is very important, and kind of Khaldunian approach seemed to be quite instructive in this regard. The second question comes from, so the first question was from Shafiq. I don't say where he's from, but Imtiaz Yusuf from Malaysia asked, did you look, since you already focused on Mawdudi, did you look at Muhammad Iqbal's view of popular sovereignty? So just quickly, did you look at
Iqbal is referenced in the book as one of the thinkers around this time that is talking about constitutionalism and this idea of the universal caliphate. But Iqbal certainly could have and should have received a lot more attention.
All right. Next question by Joe Kaminsky, who is in Bosnia, actually. Would you then contend that the logical conclusion of the thought of Mawdudi and Qutb in an ideal setting in which Muslims properly reclaim their agency, reject Jahiliyyah, etc., is democracy, albeit with certain clear red lines and limitation, or is this too far of a stretch?
Definitely too far of a stretch. So Mawdudi, like I said, at least in his writings on, in Islam and Constitution, is still very much of a kind of, not clericalist, I don't want that to be misunderstood, but he says that the authority to determine what Islamic law is, to codify Islamic law, rests with the ulama. And it's a kind of, it's an authorization of scholars to exercise a huge amount of agency in defining what the scope of legitimate lawmaking is. Qutb is not an institutional design theorist, right? I'm unaware of any place where Qutb really talks about what the Islamic state ought to look like. His emphasis is much more on, if you implement this Islamic system and if you bring about the Sharia, that this will kind of magically have all these effects on society and economics and virtue and so forth. And there it's more like you have this popular force that is behind this. And it's kind of a cliche to compare Qutb to, a kind of Leninism or Bolshevism, where you have a vanguard, right, a tali'a that takes control of this. But it certainly does not necessarily result in democracy in anything that we would recognize as democracy, right? Possibly a kind of popular fascism, right? Now, to the extent that, how is fascism different from pre-modern authoritarianism, right? Clericalism or monarchism or something like that, and right? So, when theorists of fascism talk about the way that, unlike earlier forms of clerical or monarchical domination, fascism rests upon a party, it rests upon a kind of claim to represent the people. Thinkers like Schmidt will say that this is as democratic as anything, because democracy is about identification. It's about the identity of political power with the people. And as long as the people can identify with it, then that's what democracy is. And so to the extent that fascism is a kind of populism, and populism is the original impulse behind democracy, then I would say that a kind of qutbism is more comparable to that kind of fascism than it would be to the kind of democracy that somebody like Ghannouchi is trying to theorize.
All right, thanks. Next question, Hanxian Lu. I believe in Malaysia, if I'm not mistaken, but if I'm mistaken, please correct me. I believe this kind of Mawdudi's conceptualization and this shift in modern times, might this be because politics in pre-modern Islamic thought was not regarded as independent science, but part of law and theology? And the sub-question, did Mawdudi therefore carve out politics as an independent field?
That's a really fascinating question. And so, and that is the way that I will very often frame this when I'm teaching students, which is, who are the thinkers that are treating politics as an independent realm, right? So your Machiavellis or Ibn Khaldun, arguably, right? Politics has its own logic and its own set of values and resources and so forth, as opposed to quintessentially Farabi, for whom it is just derivative of philosophy and ethics and epistemology. Or arguably, thinkers in the juridical tradition for whom it is an application of fiqh or kalam or something like that. And so, that is an interesting question. I want to push back on that a little bit, because I think one of the things that is utopian about Mawdudi, and perhaps more so Qutb, is that they're not really talking about actual politics, right? Qutb has this very ideal conception of what human nature is like. It's ideal even in its non-ideal nature, right? It's in the sense that, well, human beings they're not perfect, they're not angels. We have physical desires, material desires, we get angry, we want revenge. And Islam is realistic in the sense that it doesn't require us to deny any of our actual desires, but it's still the sense that politics is still the space of moral realization and moral perfection. And one of the things that it doesn't do is it doesn't actually have a diagnosis of the development of modern economies, the development of the international state system, or how political judgment is an actual sort of like independent sphere of human intellectual activity, as opposed to just an application of your reading of theology. So I appreciate the question very, very much, but I think I would push back on it a little bit and still say that while all of the emphasis is still on what action politics is supposed to bring about, it's still this very, very much idealized conception of politics as a space of moral transformation. And that is, I think, a kind of lacuna in a lot of even later Islamist thought. That Islamist thought can become more moderate, right? It can say, well, it's not incompatible with various kinds of separation of powers or democracy or political pluralism, but there's still this sense in, well, what does Islam bring to our understanding of politics? And one of the things that I'm really interested in, and I'm sure there are people that have written about this and I should just be paying more attention, is what would like a distinctly political Islamic political thought look like? That's one of the questions that I end my book with, which is a lot of these Islamic political actors have decades of experience in politics, rotting in prison, dealing with authoritarian rulers, being in exile, and now then coming back into politics, organizing, trying to form constitutions, right? And so this idea that how does that actual experience inform a distinct mode of thinking about politics that is not just a kind of stylized treatment of the Islamic political system or the Islamic state or the Islamic political order or something like that. That may exist and people may have written about that. I may just be confessing my own ignorance here.
Yeah, thanks for the answer. So we have a few more questions and I would like to answer them, but let's try to sort of go through them. I wouldn't say quickly, give them their due, but still try to wrap it up within the next 5 to 10 minutes. So Ziryab Jamal asked a couple of questions. I'll choose one of them. How far do you think this utopian strain was influenced by Maxim Gorky, Martin Buber, Lausanne, ultimately Nietzsche, demagogic fantasies of redemption. So that's just there. If you can make.
I don't really know about the. I would want to leave that to an actual intellectual historian that is tracing these sorts of things. I think there's an interesting story there to be written about the way in which a lot of sort of like mysticist and right-wing figures in Europe influenced the thinking of thinkers like Maududi and Qutb and Ghannouchi and others on their diagnosis of the West. So this idea that the West is maybe like what your former Naval War College student's father found resonant in Qutb, that right, the West is amoral, that has completely separated matter from the soul, that it is kind of, like Wael Halak's view, right? That it's completely amoral, that it has no grounding in any kind of philosophical anthropology or something like that. My sense is that a lot of the thinking about how bad the modern West is and secularism is informed by a lot of Western thinkers. But I want to hold off from saying that their interpretation of what Islam ought to be is indebted to an encounter with these kinds of Western thinkers, because I'm sure there are people that are doing that work in a very rigorous way and reading unpublished things and who was reading whom and those kinds of things.
Okay, very good, thanks. Ali A asks, in the book, do you talk about the human agency as it relates to the Caliphate of Men? And another question, what about the Shia understanding of Caliphate of Men? Though Shia understanding is much more theocracy, does this have a place in the book?
So the first answer is that a lot of what I'm arguing about Ghannouchi is the way in which a theory of why the people not only has a kind of status, right, or a dignity, that human beings are dignified by God, that human beings in the broad sense are meant to be represented by their political order, but also are the ones that have the agency and the capacity to bring about these changes. That is entirely established by Ghannouchi's reading of the Caliphate, of the Universal Caliphate. So that's one point. And the other point is that I do not deal with a lot of Shia thought, partially because I didn't want the book to be too sprawling. I wanted to track a particular kind of debate, and because there's a lot of really, really good work these days on sort of like post-1979 reformist thinking in Shia circles and all that. And I didn't think that I had a way of fitting that into the book beyond referencing it, that there are these broader discussions, right, in sort of post-Islamic revolution Iranian and Shia thought.
All right, thanks. Noah Solomon, he's writing from Beirut, not in Sudan this time. Well, Noah.
Or Minnesota.
Or Minnesota, yeah. I hope you're doing well. It says, this has been great conversation. Thanks to Ermin. Andrew, okay, somewhat of a version of Ermin's last question. Andrew, you mentioned the Arab Spring as a context that inspired the reading that led to this book. Can you tell us a little more about the contemporary uses or not? And if so, why not? This is a so academic question. I always ask my students. By contemporary Islamic activists, calling for overthrow of authoritarian systems or otherwise speaking the name of Shab, of these ideas of popular sovereignty in modern Islamic thought that you have unpacked in these books. I mean, beyond Al-Ghannouchi himself, in short, I'm curious if you have some sense as to what is the uptake of these ideas, particularly in these contexts of moral and even confessional pluralism, like those you have mentioned by people working on the ground. Have these ideas, have they seen these ideas as Renaissance in this populist age or not? And if not, why? So that's quite a bit there. So I hope you can address these questions that Noah is asking.
Yeah, so I was not on the ground during the Arab revolutions. And so once again, I defer to, anthropologists and other scholars that were. I will say sort of impressionistically that I have heard people that were at Tahrir, for example, that they said that they encountered Ghanouchi's book for the first time, there when they were, perhaps non-Islamist youth, revolutionary youth that were encountering Islamist counterparts, and what is your idea of the state? And so that these ideas did sort of permeate, that they when you ask somebody, so what is this Islamist idea of democracy, that figures like Ghanouchi, not exclusively, had a kind of transnational prestige. That's one point. The other point is that if we're talking about the revolution itself, so my sense is that neither the Tunisian nor the Egyptian revolution, insofar as they are these sort of exceptional moments, right, in which there is a rupture with the previous order and there is an attempt of establishing a popular voice, that they were not ideologically specific, right? That there was a lot of emphasis on the shab, right, or bread, freedom, and social justice. That the slogans of revolutionary popular sovereignty were necessarily not ideologically specific to any particular party. They weren't excessively secularist. They weren't excessively Islamist. And that was part of what a lot of people found so inspiring, if not magical, about the Tunisian and the Egyptian revolution, that they appeared to come out of nowhere. They appeared to represent this kind of popular sovereignty and moral unity that wasn't immediately observable prior to this, and that perhaps by definition, that requires there not being an extensive debate at that time about what kind of state are we trying to build? What are we trying to replace the authoritarian state with? So my sense is that there probably would not have been a lot of specific. Also, it's not a time for debating these sorts of ideas when you're being, surrounded by the security apparatus and you're trying to survive, or you're trying to occupy a particular sort of space. And the final answer to that question is that I think what a lot of revolutionaries found very frustrating, and this sometimes resulted in this claim that Islamists stole the revolution or something like this, is that in which the exceptional politics of the square or of the street or of revolution transform themselves into the ordinary politics of elections, campaigning, and constituent politics, right? Drafting constitutions. Political theorists very often treat constituent politics, right? The politics of creating a new political order as this kind of exceptional moment, right? You're outside of the normal stream of day-to-day governance, and it's this moment in which the people is embracing its sovereignty and creating a new order. But we know that constituent moments are not like that. They're very much ordinary political moments. They were constituted by parties that campaigned for representation in constituent assemblies. They were very often consisted in not saying what you believed in, right? Not announcing to the people, this is the particular kind of state that we want to create. Electoral politics are often about remaining vague, about not engaging in extensive intellectual elaborations of your deeper philosophical views. And then they often involve ordinary political bargaining as opposed to grand statements of popular representation. So, again, that may be just a way of referring to other people, but my sense is that unlike what you might think, that the constituent moments in both Egypt and Tunisia don't appear to have been spaces of great debating over philosophical and theological foundations for politics, right? The way that we sometimes look at France between 1991 and 1993 as producing all kinds of great treatises on representation and sovereignty and so forth. I've not read anything that suggests that the 2011 right? to 2014 period produced analogous kinds of statements. That may not be answering Noah's question, but.
All right, thanks. And we have one final question by Malik Zeta. He's asking the Sharia and Khilafah as utopian in the Andrew Marchian sense, as opposed to what exactly in the pre-modern Khaldunian Mowerdian sense?
I think I answered that earlier, so let me just reiterate. So, when you read, when you read Mawardi or Ibn Khaldun or others, the emphasis is very much on, politics or governance as the reduction of harm, right? What happens when you don't have governance, right? You have chaos, you have civil war, you have fitna. That politics is about keeping order. Yes, certain kinds of regimes like the Khilafah are about securing your otherworldly interests, right? Your interests in the next world. Although somebody like Ibn Khaldun does not go into great detail about this, right? Ibn Khaldun will say the difference between a rational mulk, right? Mulk aqli, and the Khilafah is that both secure worldly interests, but the Khilafah also secures your interest in the next life. But I don't remember him going into great detail in elaborating how exactly establishing the Khilafah helps your soul in the next life. And so, so that's the kind of claim, is that I don't want to go too far with it, right? I don't want to say that it was either secular or that there wasn't a consideration of how politics in this world can be conducive to living a good life. It just wasn't. It wasn't the beginning like it was for Greek philosophy or Farabi or others to say, how does a certain kind of political order lead to the realization of virtue or reason or something like that? And so it's something that I think bears further consideration. The way that thinkers like Qutb saw politics as the necessary space for the realization of justice, virtue, and a kind of moral solidarity.
Thank you so much. And I think that brings us to the end of our conversation. This has been a fascinating conversation, Andrew. That's such a great book, and I hope that more people are going to read it and engage with its ideas, use it in teaching. I think it's a great text to use in teaching. If anyone is teaching anything on modern Islamic thought, Islam and politics, anything of that nature, intellectual history of Islam, especially in modern context, I think it's a great book for that, because you engage with ideas in such a rich way and such an engaging manner, and you use a lot of references. Maybe just one more thing. I know that you are working on a book on Rashid al-Ghannouchi himself. Maybe tell us a little bit, give us a preview of that book. I think our audience and wider audience would be interested to know. So maybe in 1 minute, if you could give us.
So it's actually a book with Ghannouchi, which is, so I had the pleasure over a few weeks and a number of different times, usually around Christmas and New Year's, of having lengthy dialogues with him that were recorded and translated, being edited on all of these themes related to law, politics, sovereignty, democracy, pluralism, his own political life and history and so forth. And so we're translating and publishing those, along with a series of 12 or 13 of his own articles and essays from before the Tunisian Revolution and after. And in addition, his book, Public Freedoms in the Islamic State, or in an Islamic State, is also presently being edited for publication by Yale University Press as part of a translation series that I edit. And so, so that is meant to just be a translation of his magnum opus from 1993. But the second volume is meant to sort of be a kind of a glimpse into what his other kind of less ideal views on politics actually look like. So very famously, his party said after 2011 that they no longer regard themselves as part of political Islam or Islamists, and they adopt this ideology of Muslim democracy, right? And you've heard this in Turkey at various points, in Indonesia. And so partially what I'm interested in, what is this difference between an Islamic democracy and the ideology of Muslim democracy? Is this just a slogan or a label, or is this actually a thought out ideal, perhaps a non-sovereigntist, non-ideal theory of politics? And if so, what does that leave for a distinctly Islamic contribution to thinking about politics and the moral dimension of political life? So that volume of his essays and our dialogues together is meant to represent a contribution to that. And then my next academic work, sort of at the monograph level, is also trying to think through these things, right? What could you reconstruct a political philosophy of Muslim democracy, and how specifically is it different from this sovereigntist view of politics, even if it's at the democratic or popular sovereigntist level? And what exactly does that look like? And what would a distinct genealogy be, right? If you have a genealogy of modern popular sovereignty going from Ridda, Maududi, Qutb to Ghanouchi, what would a distinct genealogy of a non-sovereigntist quote unquote Muslim ideology of Muslim democracy look like? What would it say about law? What would it say about political authority? What does it say about pluralism? How deep does an appreciation of political and moral pluralism go? And anyway, so those are the questions that I'm working on, both in my own academic work and in this volume with Ghanouchi, that hopefully should be out next year with Oxford University Press.
All right, and we wish you good luck with that. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Right.
And to all of you who have joined us, please check out the work of the Center for Islam in Contemporary World at our website. That is contemporaryislam.org. That is the book, and please read it, buy it, and support the work of the academics, as we always do. So with that being said, thank you so much, and until next time, all the best.
Thanks very much for this. This is a real treat. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.